Questions about the scope and causes of income inequality have resonated loudly in the U.S. in recent years.
At a time of massive income and wealth inequality, maybe, and Chuck, this is a radical idea, but maybe, just maybe, government should represent the needs of a struggling working class.
Now, a new economics book about these issues is making a big and surprising splash of its own.
Perhaps the most unlikely bestseller in America, the English translation of French economist Thomas Piketty's 577-page tome, Capital. His recent U.S. press tour was likened to Beatlemania, with standing room-only events.
I'm back in the USSR. You don't know how lucky you are. Back in the USSR.
We came here at 6 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 to see them, and all they do is push you farther and farther away, and then they don't even let you see them.
Nobel laureates on stage with him piled on the praise.
It's a fantastic book.
Especially ones tilting left, who share concern for the global trend the 42-year-old Parisian has definitively documented: growing economic inequality.
Like it or not, you are considered geniuses, so take it.
So first, let's get into who Thomas Piketty is and why his research has been so influential.
So Thomas Piketty is a French economist that really kind of burst into the scene of the academic sphere in the early 2000s, working on the question of inequality and economic trends in inequality. First, he started off with academic papers, mainly doing work with his co-author, Emmanuel Saez, who's based out at University of California, Berkeley. And the two of them worked on the empirical measurements of inequality. Piketty became something of an academic celebrity, though, about a decade later. So in 2014, he wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century that uses some of his own data work that called for an overhaul of international tax systems to address the problem of inequality, basically using progressive taxation to undermine and prevent the reconstitution of wealth concentration at the very top of society, basically the top 1%. And that book became something of a bestseller and thrust him into the limelight as a public intellectual in addition to an academic economist.
So now what you guys have done is looked at his research and basically gone about and seen what are the flaws here.
Yeah, so the background on all this goes to this 2003 paper that they wrote in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and it became a very influential paper. It has thousands of citations. The basic gist of it, it tries to measure the concentration of income for the top 1% of society in the United States, going all the way back as far as we have records. So basically the early 20th century. And what they show in this paper, or purport to show, is has since become known as the Ucurve of Inequality, the Ucurve pattern. And it shows that in the early 20th century, you had really high inequality. It lasts until about World War II. Then it nosedives. And then it levels out at the middle of the century. And then it rebounds during the Ronald Reagan years. And then the idea is that the rebound is still continuing and inequality is going through the roof as a result of that. And the major claim they make on the policy side of this is they have this U-curve and they claim to measure the income distribution of the United States across time. And then they ask the question, well, why does it change? Why does it go from very high to very low from about the 1940s to 1980? And then why does it rebound again? And the answer they come up with is they say that this coincides with the high income tax rates of the mid-century. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in office for 4 terms as United States president, and part of his fiscal and economic package tied to the New Deal and also tied to the finance of World War II was he raised income taxes on the top earners to extraordinarily high levels. So by the 1940s, he had hiked them all the way up to 91% as the top marginal rate on the wealthiest earners. So that's all income above a certain level gets taxed at 91% according to this the scheme that was put forth in the IRS. And Piketty and Saez, in their paper, they basically say, well, it's those high tax rates that are driving down inequality. And then as soon as we got rid of the high tax rates, so they lasted until about the early 1980s, and Ronald Reagan famously overhauls the tax system and reduces it to, I think it was hovering in the 70% range by the 1980s, and he cuts it down to roughly where it is today, the high 20s and low 30% range for different brackets, and it's kind of hovered over there ever since. But the claim is that when taxes are high, inequality is low, and then when taxes are cut, inequality rebounds.
So now what you have done with the other fellows is found that there's massive flaws in this data and the way that they looked at things. And so basically you show that it's more of a teapot curve. So it's not as steep and as low. And so basically it's not as unequal as they are purporting it to be.
So that's exactly it. What we did is we reconstructed their entire data series. So we went back and we replicated it to start with, and then we found that there are errors. And the errors deal with how they handle tax statistics from the early 20th century in particular. So our paper looks at the first half of the U-curve, 1917 to 1960. That's the window we're looking at. And that's really the most momentous window in their historical narrative, because that's when the high tax rates are put in place. That's when what's referred to as the Great Leveling occurs. There's a drop in inequality in their series, and it's very rapid, very compressed drop over a couple of years in World War II. So we went and looked at that, and what we found is they had made some very unjustifiable assumptions when constructing their data series in that period. Because, tax records, they get worse the further back in time you go, but there are at least some IRS records from about the 19-teens onward. That's after the income tax comes into place in 1913, so we do have some IRS records, but the quality gets really bad. And really, any time before 1943-44, you've got some major data issues you have to deal with. The real reason, the issue there is in between those two tax years, between 43 and 44, the IRS overhauled how it did accounting. And what it did is it imposed the standards that we still use today. It's called an adjusted gross income standard. So when you file your tax forms, you're basically calculating your adjusted gross income. And that is the income you actually retain is a component of that, but there are all these categories of deductions that you are allowed to claim under the law, whether it's a standard deduction or if you itemize, you can take out things like charitable contributions, state and local tax payments, there's some interest payments that can be taken out, and a whole bunch of different categories like that. And almost everyone that has a tax accountant knows these categories. So to get the adjusted gross income, you have to actually have a very full, encompassing assessment of what's actually reported on the tax form. And what happened previous to the AGI switch that occurs in between 43 and 44 is the IRS used some different accounting standards. The main one was called a net income standard. So it's income without those deductions included in it. So the deductions are taken away, and it's what's left after the deductions, basically. So in order to reconcile the two, you have to do adjustments to the IRS records, the tax data that they are publishing in all years from 1943 and prior. And that means you have to go find and identify what was deducted and add it back in. Well, Piketty-Sayes didn't do that. That's a major problem that we found in their series, and we found a way to correct for those errors. The other thing they do is prior to the 1940s, the federal income tax eligibility threshold in the United States was very, very high. In some years, it was like less than 10% of families were even eligible to pay the income tax, and it's only the wealthy and upper middle class that this tax applies to. And that changes over time.
Wow.
So FDR, one of his major initiatives when he expands the income tax system, he also pushes it downward, the threshold downward, so middle class and then eventually poor people also have to pay income taxes. This is part of the World War II revenue ramp up. So it's really a regressive thing that FDR's never really associated with, because they like to present him as this great progressive who cares about the poor, but he really is the probably one of the biggest taxers of the poor in American history. But that's neither here nor there. What is interesting, though, is it has huge implications for all data before the 1940s. It means that the IRS records are fundamentally incomplete. They don't capture incomes from the middle class on down. And if you're trying to measure what share of society owns or receives a certain percentage of income, you're trying to measure the top 1% or 5% or 10%. Not having that segment of data is a big problem. So what we found is an adjustment that Piketty and Sayers had made to address that problem. What they did is they took a difference between, it's really complex accounting tricks that have to be done here, but they essentially apply a multiplier to their series that's based on taking the ratio of single filers from married filers, because there was a difference in the threshold they had to pay, and therefore you can estimate what's missing. Big problem, though, they chose the year 1942 as their index for this multiplier. And anyone knows what's going on in history in 1942 knows that's the first full year that the United States has entered World War II. And if you're trying to look at singled versus married filers to get a ratio, well, what happens to the single military age male workforce in the United States in 1942? They all enlist in the Army.
We will all make certain that this time is the last time. This time we will not say curtain till we ring it down in our own hometown. For this time we are out to finish the job we started then. Clean it up all time this time, so we won't have to do it again.
So major disruptions.
That's a massive factor.
And you cannot use that year to project, say, what the workforce would have been in 1935 or 1925 or 1915. And yet that's what essentially they attempt to do. So we correct for that.
Now, also, as somebody who's not an economist, just looking at this from the outside, I think, well, it would make sense to me that you would have kind of more equality in a sense when you have all of these events going on, all of these crises and world wars, because everybody is pretty broke, right? So what I find interesting about anybody who wants to impose equality by taxation, by progressive taxation, is that they always seem to want to bring everybody down to a certain level.
They want to achieve what the Great Depression and the World Wars achieved through human disaster. So that's really kind of a depressing outlook on what the goals are here. Now they're saying, well, we can do this in times of peace. We can do this in times of economic prosperity by just using the tax mechanism. But it turns out the tax mechanism is probably the weakest of the causal claims that are being made here. Once you correct the data, it really just doesn't align with their timeline. But what is still there, what is pronounced, is in fact the Great Depression has a huge leveling effect. It undermines and destroys quite a bit of the wealth that accrued through capital gains in the 1920s. So the first few years after the stock market crash, you see a very rapid leveling at the top of society. The top 1% loses astronomical amounts of money, especially on a year-to-year basis, on their income basis, for those first 3 or 4 years after the stock market crash. And that alone is probably the trigger driver of this great leveling. It's the main shift to pay attention to. And then, of course, World War II, it certainly has an effect, but it has an effect more so internationally because, the war, even though it is very stressful on the United States, it's stressful on the North American continent, it's not being fought here. It's being fought in Europe. It's being fought in Asia. And the physical aspects of the destruction of the war, the physical destruction of real estate and capital that's tied up into it, is playing out across the cities of Europe, for example. So you can have a leveling effect there, which is really interesting to study from a historical perspective, but it's certainly not something we want to celebrate as a cure to inequality.
Yeah, so I think that's That's really the point here, is that people would rather use taxation and intervention to achieve equality at all costs than to use an approach which is smaller government,
Right.
which steps away from intervention and taxation, which allows the individual to flourish, and then as a byproduct, the people around them to gain wealth and for prosperity to grow that way. Basically, they're showing that there's more inequality when you have a free market. So they can't go for that. But is that really accurate?
It's not accurate at all. And here's a really interesting twist on the Piketty Says material. Some other scholars that they've been working with attempted to do the same type of a measurement in Russia, including the old Soviet Union, the Soviet years. So they also find a U-curve, that there's very high inequality before the Soviets take over, then it plummets down to nothing, and then it rebounds again after the end of the Soviet Union. And you're looking at this and you're kind of scratching your head. What's the story that they're trying to tell here? Well, they're saying, oh, the Soviet Union was much more equal. But we look at the reality faced by people living in the Soviet Union. It's one of the most unequal societies in human history. It means that there's mass immiseration. Everybody's poor except for the political elite, and they're all living in mansions, and they have their estates on the countryside, and have extreme luxury. If you're a political elite, you're a high-ranking member of the Communist Party, you're doing great. If you're anyone and everyone else, you're in abject poverty, you're facing famine, starvation, genocide, all of these terrible things. So the U-curve that they're depicting for the Soviet Union and Russia isn't measuring true inequality, it's measuring reported inequality, official statistics that are on the books. And those statistics give a very misleading picture about what its life is like living in the Soviet Union versus life both before and after the Soviet Union, when there are at least opportunities to escape some of the most horrendous oppression that existed in human history. So it's really kind of a perverse implication of the way that they are approaching this statistically, because one of the claims that would be made is that the Soviet Union should have been a great place where there's all sorts of equality, and should have been this like beacon of how society can be equalized and removed away from extreme wealth. And it turns out that the practical experience on the ground for those who live there is complete misery.
Right. That's a great point, Phil. And you have to wonder if the data points of the political elite in the Soviet Union entered into those studies.
Oh, of course they don't, because they're not measured as income. They're not measured as personal returns. It's all favors that are provided by the government to the political elites.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I also found that there was an opinion piece posted by Piketty just this morning. So it's called "The Western Elite is Preventing Us from Going After the Assets of Russia's Hyper-Rich." So he's turning his gaze over there. But if you actually read the paper, what he's talking about is having a top income earner wealth tax for the whole world internationally.
And, this has been a theme of Piketty's work, unfortunately, and really the political advocacy end of his work. So the further he's moved away from the academic journals, the more aggressive he's become in political advocacy. The old saying is that if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Piketty's political work has kind of morphed into, if your only tool is high progressive taxation, every problem looks like it can be solved by the imposition of this giant global wealth tax. So whenever there's a crisis that comes along, whether it's the Russia-Ukraine situation right now, whether it's previous crises, he's made similar claims about things like climate change. He's made other claims about various political regimes that he dislikes in the past decade or so. And the narrative is always the same, that like taxes are the big fix to everything. I don't know if anyone's seen the old Robin Hood movie that Disney made in the 1970s, and there's Prince John, and he's got his bags of coins, and he's saying, taxes, beautiful taxes.
Taxes, beautiful, lovely taxes. Double the taxes, triple the taxes. Squeeze every last drop out of those insolent musical peasants.
Piketty Piketty is strangely become like a real life caricature of this figure, and that taxes are the solution to everything. And a lot of the claims are just really